Welcome. So today, we're tackling a really tough question, one that gets to the heart of some of the darkest chapters in human history. How is it that ordinary people, people who think of themselves as good, decent human beings, end up doing absolutely monstrous things?
Right? It's a question that just follows us through history. When we see these unimaginable acts of cruelty, our first instinct is to think the people who did them must be pure evil, just monsters. But what if the truth is way more complicated and honestly a lot more disturbing? What if, under the right circumstances, they're people just like you and me?
Well, to even begin to unpack that, we need to look at a concept that sociologists came up with to explain exactly how this kind of state-sponsored violence happens. It's a powerful idea called crimes of obedience. So, what does that mean? Basically, these are harmful, often illegal acts done by people who genuinely believe they're just following orders from someone in charge. This whole term was developed by two sociologists, Kelman and Hamilton, while they were studying the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. They were trying to figure out how soldiers can end up killing hundreds of unarmed civilians, and their conclusion was just startling. It wasn't about the soldiers being inherently evil, it was about the incredible, overwhelming power of authority.
And here's the core idea that is so disturbing. The people committing these acts don't see themselves as the bad guys. Not at all. In their own minds, they are moral people, just doing their jobs. Because a higher-up gave the order, they feel the action is totally legitimate. The responsibility? That's not on them. It belongs to the person who gave the command.
So, how does that actually happen? I mean, how does a person's moral compass just get switched off? Well, Kelman and Hamilton laid out a really clear three-step process. It's like a recipe that makes it possible for ordinary people to commit some truly extraordinary crimes.
This whole process of what they call moral disengagement, it starts with authorization. The command comes from someone they see as a legitimate boss. So suddenly, they feel like they're not responsible for their own actions anymore. They're just a tool. Then comes routinization. The horrible act gets broken down into these small, repetitive, boring tasks. It starts to feel like any other day at the office, just paperwork and procedures. And finally, the ugliest step. Dehumanization. The victims are stripped of their humanity. They're no longer seen as people, but as objects, numbers, or targets. And once that happens, violence becomes chillingly permissible.
Now, you might be thinking this is just a theory, right? A way to explain things after the fact. But here's the thing. This process has been demonstrated with terrifying clarity in controlled lab experiments, and of course, observed in the real world during some of our darkest times.
This quote from the social psychologist Stanley Milgram, wow, it just hits the nail on the head. He believed that the situation, not your character, is the most powerful influence on your behavior. And he decided to put that idea to the ultimate test in one of the most famous and controversial experiments of all time.
So, picture this. It's 1963. Milgram brings regular, everyday people into his lab. An authority figure, a guy in a white lab coat, instructs them to deliver what they're told are increasingly powerful electric shocks to another person in a separate room. Now, of course, the person getting shocked was an actor and the shocks weren't real, but the participants, they had no idea. They thought it was all real.
And the results were absolutely staggering. 65%. I mean, let that sink in. 2 out of every 3 people were willing to administer the final, most powerful shock, which was marked as extremely dangerous. Why? Simply because the man in the lab coat calmly told them to continue. It was just a horrifying demonstration of how easily a situation can override our own moral judgment.
So, if that's what happens in a sterile lab with just one authority figure, what happens when you apply those same principles on a massive national scale? Well, sociologist Zygmunt Bauman took this exact logic to analyze the Holocaust. He argued that it wasn't some kind of backwards slide into barbarism, but actually a chilling, twisted product of modern society itself.
This slide really breaks down his point perfectly. Bauman's argument was that the Holocaust was made possible by the efficiency of modern bureaucracy. Think about it. With a huge division of labor, personal responsibility gets spread so thin that nobody feels like it's their fault. The main goal shifts from, is this right, to, is this efficient? And in a system like that, mass murder gets transformed from a horrific moral crime into a cold, technical, administrative problem that just needs to be solved.
But what about after the fact? How do states and institutions even get away with these kinds of crimes? How do they dodge accountability? Well, as it turns out, there's a playbook for that too. Sociologist Stanley Cohen figured out this really predictable pattern, which he called the spiral of denial. It starts simple, with just outright denial. Nope, didn't happen. But when the evidence becomes too overwhelming to ignore, the narrative shifts to step 2, reinterpretation. Okay, fine, something happened, but it wasn't genocide. It was a civil war. And finally, when even that doesn't hold up, they move to the last resort, justification. Even if it was what you say it was a painful but necessary thing we had to do for national security. It's an incredibly effective playbook for avoiding responsibility.
Okay, so after going through all of that grim stuff, why does this matter? Why is it so important to understand this theory? Well, to see its real value, we have to look at it critically, both its incredible strengths and, of course, its limitations.
So the strength of this theory is its sheer power to explain the unthinkable. It connects one person's actions to these massive impersonal state structures, and it shines a huge spotlight on the hidden dangers of bureaucracy. But it's not perfect. It can sometimes focus so much on the extreme cases and the power of the system that it kind of downplays individual resistance. You know, the brave people who do say no. And because you're dealing with these huge social forces, it's really, really hard to prove or measure any of this stuff empirically. At the end of the day, what this does is completely flip our whole understanding of crime on its head. We usually think of criminals as rebels, as people who break the rules. But what this theory shows us is a much darker truth. Some of the worst evils in history weren't committed by breaking rules, but by following them, blindly and without question.
And that leaves us with one final vital question that we have to ask ourselves, in our own lives and in our own societies. At what point does just doing what you're told cross a line? When does obedience itself become the ultimate crime?